A frozen window hides more than ice. It holds a clue. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host. Hello. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your voices always brighten this journey. Let's begin. It was the sort of cold that steals its way into your bones without haste, as though time itself had conspired to slow the blood. Oxford in winter always seemed more itself than in any other season. The stone colleges crouched like weary animals, the streets emptied earlier than sense required, and the river stiffened into silence under a pall of mist. I found myself, not for the first time, in the Jericho Arms with a half-finished pint before me, watching the condensation gather and break upon the glass. The world outside was pressed against the window, blurred by frost, a palimpsest of light and shadow etched by cold. There is a curious art to frost on glass. Each pattern forms a geometry of secrecy, like handwriting only half legible, or a memory one can almost grasp. The pane opposite my seat had become a frozen canvas, branches of ice spreading outwards in delicate confusion, veins and tributaries of some secret map. I traced them absently with my eyes and thought how truth, when it comes, never arrives with such clarity. More often it lies hidden, caught between surfaces, until the thaw reveals too much or too little. Lewis had rung earlier with something inconsequential, a stolen bicycle if I recall correctly. He has an energy I've long since lost the capacity to admire. I told him I was unwell, which was a half-truth. I felt no illness, but carried the familiar weight of a day too long, and the company of silence was preferable to the clumsy cheer of procedure. At the bar, a man ordered whiskey with the voice of one who had abandoned hope of warmth. His breath rose visibly as he turned to the door, and when it opened, a draught of night air wandered through the room. I caught the scent of rain upon stone, mingled with the dry bitterness of ash. It reminded me of evenings long gone, when I believed a companion might wait at home, and when the sound of footsteps across a courtyard meant anticipation rather than duty. I pulled the crossword from my pocket. The clue that defeated me yesterday still did so now. Frozen Truth, 7. I stared at the letters already scrawled in uncertain ink. T-A-H. Something mocked me from within the word, a whisper that refused to grow audible. I pushed it aside, as one does with an unsolved matter, and let the thought dissolve into the rim of my glass. The college bells sounded faintly through the fog, the iron tongue softened by distance. Oxford lives on its bells, and each seems to measure not merely the hour, but the erosion of hope. I remember thinking that the city's scholars had always tried to outwit mortality with words, with symbols pressed into stone, but it is frost that writes the more lasting poetry, and no man can read it. An old fellow by the fire spoke quietly to his neighbour of a lecture just delivered at St. Cuthbert's. The subject, some medieval poet whose name slipped from my ear, was dismissed as obscure. Yet the words lingered, not for their content, but for their tone. A man gone too soon, too solitary, too little remarked upon. I felt the prick of interest that usually precedes a case, though at that time I had no inkling. It was merely a chord struck faintly as though a string inside me had quivered without reason. I drained what remained of the pint, a mouthful of bitterness half-tempered by chill. Through the window I watched the street lamp halo itself in mist, the glass dividing me from the world outside. My reflection floated upon it, pale, superimposed upon the frozen patterns as though I were trapped behind the pane. I thought then of how often one sees without seeing, how often the real shape of a thing is obscured by beauty. The crossword remained unanswered, the clue insistent. Frozen truth. The word, I felt, would come to me at the wrong time, as all things worth knowing do. I gathered my coat, felt the cold reach eagerly for me, and walked into the night where the windows of Oxford glimmered with their silent, intricate frost, each pane hiding behind its fragile secrecy. Lewis collected me at first light, the city holding its breath beneath mist. He said, "A death at St. Cuthbert's, a professor, elderly, reclusive, natural causes likely. I watched bicycles pass like intentions postponed and told him we should go. St. Cuthbert's survives by modesty. The gate is prouder than the buildings it defends, the quad a square of grass that apologizes for existing. We crossed it silence while a broom whispered along stone. The porter met us with porch-like courtesy. Professor Alan Hathersley had been found by a scout who came to lay a fire. The doctor had looked, the master informed, the forms obediently begun, and there was Frost. We climbed a staircase that creaked like an old admission. The corridor smelt of paper that had waited too long for a hand. Hathersley kept visitors seldom, the porter said. He ate manuscripts and silence, wine when he could afford it. Enemies drew only a shrug. The rooms were tidy in the severe way of men who rely on thought to tidy the rest. Kindling lay by an unlit grate. The professor lay upon the bed with a meekness that survives us all. The doctor, bored by certainty, declared the heart had remembered its age. I might have agreed if not for the window. I saw it before I knew what I had seen. On the inside of the glass a delicate pelt of frost had grown, ferny, domestic, quietly improper. I lifted a hand and felt the cold answer me. Lewis asked what drew me. Only winter being over-familiar, I said, and asked whether the window had stood open. The scout, a young woman with the look of someone who reads at breakfast, said the latch had been shut when she entered, though a thread of air had seemed to move behind it. She fetched help at once. The porter confirmed no one had touched it since. Frost within forms where warm breath meets a surface colder than itself. If the window had been closed through the night, such little warmth as lingered would have held. If it had stood open, why close it after? I asked the doctor about ventilation. Some men like a draught, he said. I looked at the unlit fire and thought some men like contradiction more. We surveyed the desk. A letter, half written, spoke of a lecture to be revised and an apology to an Eleanor Venn. There was a line about Winter's old hand at the window, borrowed, I thought, and not quite accurately. The misquotation nagged. I slipped the letter into my pocket, not for evidence yet, but for company. Lewis moved with practiced kindness, speaking softly to the scout, who seemed ashamed of having found a body. I asked for the porter's register of entries for the previous evening. He said he would bring it to the lodge. He mentioned, as an afterthought, that the professor had rung for a heater last week and then refused it when it came. Economical, he said, or perverse. Before we left, I returned to the window. My breath made a faint circle upon the inner frost and then surrendered. Truth behaves like that, arriving only where there is the least warmth to receive it. I told Lewis we would come back at dusk. He asked whether I suspected anything other than time. Time is never innocent, I said, and the weather here has learned manners. We stepped into a quad that pretended at brightness. Chapel bells measured fidelity to the hour. At the gate I tasted coal in the air, and behind it the sour patience of old stone. Natural causes may be correct, they are hospitable. I made a note to find the poem that had been borrowed, and to ask why it had chosen to be wrong. Cold followed us to the car. Lewis and I began our rounds, the way a damp morning begins its argument with stone, patient and resigned. St. Cuthbert's prefers understatement, staircases that hesitate before they creak, corridors that smell of chalk and old wool, windows filmed with breath that has nowhere better to be. We started with the classicist. Precision, I have learned, is best attempted before lunch. Dr. Sylvia Markham kept an office as if grammar had arranged the furniture. Books stood to attention, a single winter flower made a disciplined point, and the desk refused the comfort of clutter. She regarded us like a stray gloss at the margin. Hathersley, she said, valued what would not answer back, and treated language like a cathedral, one entered reverently or not at all. She had dined alone, marked Euripides until the spine protested, and gone early to bed with a headache that preferred Latin. When I mentioned frost within the dead man's window, she let her eyes rest a second too long on the sill behind me, as if the word itself might breed crystals. "Some men sleep with the window open, even in winter," she offered, and then allowed herself a correction that sounded like taste, masquerading as logic. No, not Professor Hathersley. He disliked drafts because they interfered with paper. She placed a hand on a book as though to steady it, and I watched the hand rather than the book. A hand will often confess what a mouth edits. Henry Lovelace waited in a lecture room that admitted its exhaustion. Chalk ghosts rehearsed abandoned arguments across the board, and the radiator clicked like a nervous metronome. His tweed enjoyed a tenure his contract did not. He spoke with the courtesy of a man who thought civility might yet be mistaken for merit. The professor had promised to read a chapter, and never had. The grievance came polished into gratitude, as if he had buffed it nightly until it gleamed with reason, yet it kept its edge. He said the Bodleian had detained him until closing and offered the evening porter's name as witness, with the small triumph of a man who knows at least one fact cannot be contradicted. I asked his subject. "Patronage," he said, "how moral economies are constructed out of private appetites and public manners." The irony needled him and he pretended not to notice. On the desk a timetable lay folded to the week's end. I saw a tutorial crossed out and the word revised migrated to a margin, as though revision were a place one could visit without being seen. We found Eleanor Venn in the library where paper makes its own weather. Bindings creaked like pews. Dust kept a gentle Sabbath. She was the sort of widow who had taught herself composure because no one else would. She spoke of Hathersley with an economy that sounded like affection properly managed. They had consulted on texts and walked the cloister after evensong because words behave differently at dusk. She had telephoned him to scold him, lightly, about the ice. His answer had been a small laugh and a phrase about his heart being older than the weather, which she repeated with the care one gives to a key that fits too many doors. When I asked whether he had seemed unwell, she let a finger pause above a shelf between two volumes that had once formed a pair but no longer did. "Some men," she said, "are unwell in the way certain books are misbound. You do not notice until the middle falls out." She replaced nothing, which was the most interesting movement of the hour. Colin Arkwright lived among boxes that advertised intention and bills that measured it. The room smelled of instant coffee and new paper. He defended the opportunism of youth with the guarded eloquence of a man auditioning for a future. The old man was a gate, he said. Some gates open if you praise the hinges. He had been at the Randolph bar until midnight and could produce witnesses, though he preferred the word admirers. He justified his hunger with poetry and, because he wished to be noticed, misquoted it. Nature, red in tooth and law, he tossed into the air like a coin that could only land as brilliance. I let the coin fall. Tennyson, I murmured, would have kept his claws. He grinned, then looked, annoyed at himself for caring. A printed call for submissions lay on the desk, folded so that only the deadline showed. "Deadlines," he said, and then laughed at the accident of phrasing, not seeing how accidents often volunteer for work. Each account contained its native contradiction. Markham professed ice and seemed warmed by it. Lovelace studied patronage while depending upon it. Eleanor's gentleness faltered by a shelf where a book had not quite returned home. Arkwright wore audacity like a borrowed coat and pinned other men's lines to its lapel. The college listened with its careful chill. Rain rehearsed itself on the chapel roof, and a clock, stubborn with duty, insisted on the hour. On the way out, Lewis suggested the heart had simply lost interest in beating, and we should allow medicine its victory. I considered the frost within, the considered pause, the displaced hand, the lecture on favour, and the wrong word that wanted to be right. Natural causes are restful, they never argue back. The crossword clue in my pocket still refused to thaw, but the misquotation had begun to warm an outline, faint as breath on glass. I kept it, a small ember, in a season that preferred the cold. The Bodleian holds its silences differently from St. Cuthbert's. There the hush feels imposed, a schoolroom discipline. Here it is older, patient, almost indulgent. Dust drifts without haste, and every page turned seems to sigh. It was in this atmosphere that Lewis produced his small discovery, pulled from a folio where it had no rightful place, a folded clipping browned into fragility, its edges brittle with 2 decades of waiting. He handed it to me with the look of a man uncertain whether he has unearthed treasure or trivia. It was a report, provincial in tone, about the disappearance of a young man in the late 70s, a student unnamed at first, then identified as Edwin Venn. The surname had the effect of a quiet bell rung in a corridor. Eleanor's late husband, or so I believed. The article described how he had left a gathering at the Randolph and never arrived at the rooms he rented in Jericho. No body, no belongings beyond what could be guessed, no closure. Lewis asked whether it was relevant. I told him everything was relevant until it wasn't. He frowned in that honest way of his, as if logic should be tidier. I slipped the clipping into my pocket. The paper crumbled a little under my touch, as though reluctant to be carried back into light. I returned to my crossword, while Lewis busied himself with catalogues. The same clue persisted, taunting in its precision. Frozen truth, 7. The letters were still there, as stubbornly misaligned as they had been 2 nights before. I wrote thawing, then crossed it out, the count wrong, the sense only half right. I tried veritas with a schoolboy's desperation, though it answered nothing. Each failure irritated me less for its inadequacy than for the memory it revived of Hathersley's window, its interior lace of ice that could not have belonged. The pain and the clue, 2 faces of the same refusal. Across the aisle, a student dropped a pencil. The sound echoed more than seemed possible, and I wondered how many objects had been misplaced, dropped, or mislaid in this city over centuries. Books, letters, promises, never to be retrieved, only leaving their faint tremors behind. I left Lewis to his orderliness and walked among the shelves. My steps fell on stone that had borne heavier scholars than I. A slip of paper protruded from a book of Tennyson, as though it wished to breathe. I tugged it free. Only a timetable of lectures, long outdated, but the coincidence of the poet's name amused me. The boy Arkwright had mangled his lines the previous day. Now the poet returned, silent witness, lodged beside the clipping in my pocket. I sat again and read the newspaper piece more carefully. Certain phrases bore the fingerprints of their writer's indifference. No trace has been found. Foul play cannot be ruled out. Yet between the lines lay what journalism rarely admits, resignation. They had expected the boy never to return, and they had been correct. I pictured Eleanor, younger then, married to absence more than to a man. I wondered what bargain she had struck with solitude. Lewis interrupted my thoughts, saying he had found nothing else, his tone implying apology. I told him not to measure worth by volume. It is the single anomaly, the overlooked word, that carries weight. He nodded, still unconvinced. I wrote the clue again, more heavily this time. Frozen truth. The pencil left a groove in the paper. I thought of ice, of mirrors, of windows that conceal by pretending to reveal. The answer hovered just beyond the reach of language, as if it preferred the company of the unsolved. I closed the crossword with a kind of irritation that only hides fatigue. Outside, the sky had paled without warmth. Snow threatened, but held itself back. The clipping rustled in my pocket as we walked down the library steps. It felt less like evidence than like an echo, and yet echoes have a way of leading one to the source. Lewis asked whether we should return to St. Cuthbert's. Not yet, I said. Let the past thaw a little first. The Randolph keeps a curated warmth, a performance of hospitality that never quite reaches the bones. I chose a table where the window reflected more lamp than night, and asked for a bottle whose price could be disguised as thoughtfulness. Eleanor Venn arrived without hurry, carrying that careful stillness I have seen in those who ration tenderness. The waiter rehearsed competence and left us to the theatre of civility. She said the college had telephoned her twice, first to inform, then to confirm. I offered the small consolations available to a stranger and felt them land with the soft failure of dry leaves. We spoke of Hathersley as one speaks of a library whose catalogue no longer fits the shelves. She remembered his fastidiousness with paper, the way he handled brittle leaves as if apology might mend them. When I mentioned the frost inside his window, she paused, then said he would have loathed such trespass and would have spoken of winter as an ungentle visitor. The sentence arrived measured, as if weighed before release. We touched the wine and let it linger. She asked whether the police believed in mercy. I told her we believed in sequence, which is sometimes crueler. The smile that followed ended before it reached her eyes. There was a letter, she said at last, stepping sideways from the path she had set. Anonymous. He destroyed it immediately. The adverb was placed with a librarian's care, as though timing were a classification. I asked how she knew the timing, and she answered because he told me later, that afternoon. The reply had the tautness of something rehearsed for private use. I tried for casualness. Did he show you the envelope? The hand? No, she said, only the fact of it. He was vexed, in that theatrical way scholars grow fond of, as though vexation were a credential. She swirled the wine and watched it settle, the small vortex saying more than the words. I thought of the clipping in my pocket about a disappearance, and of a younger man whose absence had left a silence with measurable edges. She spoke of chapel walks, of the small domesticities of friendship that pass for intimacy among clever people. He admired a poem about winter windows, she said, and then seemed to regret the disclosure. I nodded as if I knew the poem, and did not. She corrected herself with a gentleness that sounded like porcelain, saying perhaps it was the idea rather than the text. It struck me that she treated memory as a curator treats a fragile exhibit, adjusting the angle to reduce glare. We ate almost nothing. The Randolph's silver pretended history, while the menu pretended generosity. Outside, rain rehearsed itself along the facade, and the lamps made puddles look like invitations. She asked whether I believed in coincidence. I said, coincidence is the city's unofficial patron. It prowls the lanes until a lonely mind agrees to keep it. She considered this, then said quietly that the letter had mentioned the past in a tone that would not bear scrutiny. He refused to keep it. He destroyed it immediately. The repetition arrived without flourish, as if certainty could be strengthened by echo. In the mirror beside us, I watched her watch herself, not watching me. I asked when she had last seen him. 2 days earlier, by the cloister, after evensong. He looked tired in the way men look when they are too proud to rest. She added that he had been irritated by a heater the college sent without asking. He disliked heat. He said warmth should be earned. I recalled the unlit grate and the absurd frost blooming on the safer side of the glass, and the idea folded itself neatly beside the adverb that would not let me alone. She spoke then of the widowhood that teaches neatness. She said grief prefers corners. It hates the middle of a room. I said nothing. Silence, when properly used, is a kind of question, and she answered it by looking away. The wine lowered in the bottle like daylight in January. Lewis would have asked for times and alibis as though accuracy might soften anything. I asked for nothing more. I thanked her for the evening and for the complication. She replied that complexity is not the same as guilt. When she left, the chair retained the faintest perfume, something spare and wintered. I finished the wine alone, considering how immediately can mean recently or without hesitation, and how either meaning might be chosen by someone who needs both. The glass fogged briefly under my breath, then cleared, leaving the window to reflect what it preferred. The library keeps its ghosts behind glass. They look out from varnished sepia and patient dust, their youth arranged by committees now politely dead. Lewis and I stood before one of those staged panoramas, the sort commissioned to flatter continuity. A long ago summer had pinned its light to a row of faces pretending not to squint. The caption named a modest college and a year I had once believed would remain recent. The rooms smelled of old paper and wax. A ladder sighed somewhere. The clock made a sound like a scholar clearing his throat. Lewis tapped the frame with a knuckle that apologized afterwards. "There," he said. "Second row left of the don with the carnation." I followed his finger to a boy with a reckless parting and an immodest tie. The card beneath offered letters that had faded with intention. The name belonged to a student later disgraced and then eased from the minutes. Even archives practice tact. Scandal is filed beneath weather. The clipping in my pocket, brittle as bark, remembered the habit of vanishing. In this city, disappearance rarely means absence, it means housekeeping. We studied the image as one studies a crossword after 3 wrong answers, patient and faintly offended. The lens had not been kind. Along the lower corner, a smear interrupted the ceremony, a blur where the photographer's world intruded. Lewis leaned in, breathing fog on glass. "Looks like someone in the pane itself," he said, a reflection captured and then rubbed away by conscientious fingers. I squinted until the blur suggested shoulders and the curve of a head, a watch chain that belonged to no undergraduate. Whoever stood there had been present and then corrected. Memory behaves the same. We edit the reflection because truth dislikes composition. Lewis ignored the sermon and asked whether the ghost could be Hathersley, earlier by several lives. Perhaps, I said, though the ears looked wrong, and Hathersley would have chosen cloister shade over summer parade. The librarian drifted over like a page turning itself and confessed the photograph had been rehung many times, too near a window where winter performs its experiments. "Sealed by frost," she said, as if the phrase were part of the catalogue. "Sealed by frost" returned me to the porter's tale. Hathersley's window bearing ice upon the inner face. He had meant metaphor. The small scientist in me bargained for fact. Frost grows inward when warmer breath meets colder truth. For patterns to bloom on the safer side, warmth must have surrendered. Either the room had fallen below the night, or the sash stood open and was closed again by a hand that disliked arguments. Lewis proposed a fire that guttered. Fires gutter politely. They do not write ferns across a pane unless invited. I felt the old irritation of a clue that behaves like weather everywhere and nowhere. I asked for a stool and climbed until my breath clouded the frame. Up close, the blur turned tender, a smudge with intention. Someone had tried to vanish precisely the fragment of history that accused him of presence. I thought of Eleanor and her careful adverbs, of Lovelace with his cultivated resentments, of Markham measuring appetite with grammar, and of Arkwright misquoting poets until they sounded new. The photograph held all of them by analogy, if not by likeness. Ambition assembled, consequence postponed, the future already annotating itself in pencil. Lewis, who reads labels before assumptions, discovered a note along the backboard. "Rehung after condensation damage," it said, with a date uncomfortably near the week Hathersley died. I pictured winter pressing its breath upon the library glass, leaving signatures that made the staff uneasy, and a hand wiping at a reflected figure until both history and cleaner were displeased. The note did not lie, it simply failed to tell the part of truth that sticks. We replaced the frame and let the shelves close about us like trees. The room resumed its cloistered patience. I felt no solution, only that modest clarity which follows when a contradiction agrees to breathe. Frost within, reflection erased, a window persuaded to tell a story it had not chosen. Somewhere a door had been opened briefly to let out heat. Somewhere someone had closed it in a hurry and hoped the glass would forget. Oxford forgets nothing. It changes the shelf and waits for you to misquote it. The crossword clue in my pocket gave its silent shrug. "Frozen truth," it said without letters, "prefers company." I put the clipping away and let the photograph keep its blur. The temptation of a neat answer is one I have never escaped. Even now, recounting that winter, I recall how readily the evidence arranged itself around Henry Lovelace, as though eager to give me respite from ambiguity. The man was designed for suspicion, the threadbare tweed that aspired to grandeur, the nervous polish with which he spoke of patronage, the air of a lecturer rehearsing applause that never quite arrived. Motive draped itself across him like a borrowed gown. Hathersley's unpublished manuscript, rumoured, whispered, coveted, had been the subject of speculative envy in common rooms for years. If such a work existed, it could have transformed a minor academic into a name worth footnoting. Lovelace, forever waiting on 10 years' reluctant blessing, had the desperation of one who has spent too long standing in doorways. Opportunity, too, seemed available. He was in college the night of Hathersley's death, and by his own account, shut away in the Bodleian until its closing bell. An alibi offered too neatly becomes a reason for doubt. I walked the quad with Lewis, rain stippling the slabs until each stone looked darker than the last. Lovelace envied Hathersley, I said. He needed the manuscript more than reputation itself. Lewis replied that envy was common enough and rarely fatal. I told him envy in Oxford was never common. It became architecture, woven into grants, fellowships, citations withheld. That evening I returned to the lecture room where Lovelace had received us. The board still bore the ghost of a diagram erased in haste. Chalk dust clung to the sill, and among the scattered notes on the desk I found one page, folded and forgotten. It referred to a lecture on medieval patronage with the annotation, "Expand with Hathersley's paper." The possessive chilled me. How had Lovelace access to Hathersley's private writing, unless he had seen it or expected to? The page trembled under my hand with the weight of confirmation. Lewis read it later and said perhaps it meant nothing more than quotation from published work. I shook my head. Hathersley had not published that line. I had seen the same words in the fragment on his desk, half a letter abandoned before death. Here was evidence of intrusion, theft, or worse. The pieces began to align. Lovelace enters Hathersley's rooms under pretext. Quarrel escalates. Hart fails under pressure of confrontation. Manuscript secured, or at least glimpsed. The frost inside the window could be explained by his hurried departure, closing sash against discovery. Circumstance whispered collaboration, and I listened. I carried the thought like a secret indulgence, savouring the symmetry of it. For a few hours I believed in its elegance. It is dangerous when a theory begins to satisfy more than the truth. The error revealed itself in something small. I examined the porter's book of entries. Lovelace had indeed returned to college late, his name scrawled with impatient ink just before midnight. Hathersley had been found the following morning, cold, long past the hour of collapse. If Lovelace had entered earlier, there was no witness. Yet the register showed him absent when absence mattered. The timeline sagged beneath scrutiny. He could not have been both reader in the Bodleian and intruder at St. Cuthbert's simultaneously. I confronted him gently. He insisted he left the library at closing, lingered in a pub until it wearied him, then returned to sign in. His manner was pompous but not panicked. He spoke of manuscripts with envy, yes, but also with the reverence of a man who still believed in texts as salvation. He lacked the bitterness required for crime. His vanity was too fragile to risk scandal. I left his rooms disheartened, though Lewis seemed relieved. We passed beneath the dripping archway where the porter nodded, oblivious to our disarray. My theory collapsed like paper left in rain. The clues had leaned towards him, yet only because I had tilted the board. Lovelace was guilty of mediocrity, of insecurity, of borrowing lines without acknowledgement, but not of murder. That night I returned to my crossword. The clue remained, frozen truth, 7. I wrote nothing, then erased it quickly, ashamed of the accuracy. The window of Hathersley's room still glittered in memory, frost inside where warmth should have been, and I felt the chill of an answer withheld. Arkwright opened the door as one opens an argument, amused before the evidence arrived. His room smelled of coffee and unpaid promises, a desk pretending to work, a mattress too honest, a radiator clicking. He gave me the only chair and fell onto the bed with a sigh rehearsed for sympathy. "Winter isn't over," he said. "Winter never ends here," I told him. "It just borrows another staircase. Debt introduces itself before its name is asked." It lingered under the talk, sharper than the coffee he poured. He called Hathersley a warden of locked cupboards, a man who believed knowledge should be licensed. Cleverness is a thin blanket, it warms only the speaker. I asked about letters, he fenced, then allowed a single confession. Once, for a lover in a muddle, he drafted a note in the weary idiom of a senior tutor, stern enough to be believed and kind enough to be forgiven. "Only once," he said. Forged is such an ugly word. He let it gleam between us like stolen silver. The admission touched the corner of my pocket where Eleanor's anonymous letter waited, and for a moment the pieces seemed eager to be friends. He had motive shaped like ambition and a temperament that mistook insolence for oxygen. When I asked his whereabouts on the night the professor died, he answered like references: the Randolph Bar, admirers who would remember if prompted, a barman who likes me for my change. Witnesses, he corrected, practiced. He denied writing to Hathersley, then he imagined how someone might have. He floated explanations like paper boats along a curb, charming, until they reached the drain. He misquoted Tennyson again, nature red in tooth and lily. "Precision," I told him, "is the one cruelty we permit." He shrugged, as if accuracy were a luxury collected for sport. On the desk lay envelopes from banks and bursars, white gulls fallen out of sky. Beneath them a stub of blue card peered. I lifted the top envelope with a finger and read the machine's small gospel. New Theatre, Oxford, Puccini, a seat and a date. He saw my interest and pushed hair off his brow in a gesture meant for mirrors. "I like opera when it stops apologizing," he said, then repeated the composer's name. The date behaved like a key. Curtain up ran against the last hours of Hathersley's life. "You went?" I said. He did. "Alone," he claimed. "Solitude is cheaper with student discount." "Anyone see you?" "The usher who resented my coat," he answered, "and the woman who told me to stop humming Desire." He kept the stub because the poor file their pleasures. Auditors are everywhere. Paper lies, perforations are stubborn. Time had been torn by a machine and kept its edge. If Arkwright had tried to invent an alibi, he would have chosen something brighter than Puccini in a winter city. His vanity prefers symbols. Students forge words, not ticket stock. The little card made a noise I trust more than eloquence. He softened. He admitted to other letters, all written to keep scandals domestic. He wanted to be useful, which is ambition disguised as virtue. He spoke of Hathersley almost tenderly, as of a gate that might open if one learned its music. His debts were real. His resentment had not learned to draw blood. We came down to a stairwell the color of boiled cabbage. Lewis asked whether the case had obliged us at last. "We have a shape," I said. "Shapes comfort the tired more than they inform the true." Outside, the Randolph rehearsed its clatter of glass. In my pocket, the crossword clue shifted once, frozen truth, and settled back into silence. Snow teased the lamps along Beaumont Street. From an upper window the boy lifted a hand with summer's bravado, and the frost on Oxford's panes pretended to melt while revealing nothing at all. Night draws a different map of Oxford. The streets retreat into their own outlines, and the colleges pull their cloaks tight. I walked without purpose I could defend, or rather with the sort of purpose that disguises itself as aimlessness. St. Cuthbert's waited like a modest confession. Frost had begun its slow embroidery across the panes, tender as dust, intricate as regret. I circled the quad as if a quiet orbit might coax a planet to speak. The porter had given me a nod that kept hours. He knew enough to let me pass without conversation. The chapel bell marked a time that belonged to no one. Along the eastern range, I paused before Hathersley's window. The frost there wore a finer lace than elsewhere, as though the glass had learned to grow beauty out of inconvenience. I remembered the first morning, the inner film, the improbable ferning, and felt that small intellectual ache that insists on terms. Frost, like truth, follows gradients. Warm air yields upon a colder surface. Delicate crystals script themselves where breath becomes silence. Inside, colder than outside, the old schoolroom principle whispered its instruction. That morning, inside had been the author. Yet the room held an unlit grate and a life lately gone out. Even a scholar's frugality would not have chilled the air beyond the night, unless the sash had been lifted briefly to invite the outside to do its work, unless a hand afterwards closed it to tidy. The scene. I stood a long time with my palm on stone. The cold travelled through the skin like a sentence delivered without emphasis. Lewis would have asked me what I waited for, and I would have answered, permission. I remembered the scout's careful account, the latch shut, the movement of air that had seemed a trick, the doctor's impatience with subtlety, the porter's phrase, sealed by frost, spoken as if the college had performed a sacrament. Someone had been here after stillness had claimed the room. Why return? To adjust a curtain, to take a paper, to close what ought to look closed. Behind me, a fox passed along the cloister with the self-possession of those who survive on other people's disorder. A window elsewhere cracked faintly, heating making its private weather. I felt the crossword in my coat as one feels an old bruise. Frozen truth, it continued to murmur. Not the thing itself, but the print of it upon glass. I traced the line of argument as a finger traces a mullion. First, a window opened to the cold when the professor's blood surrendered. Second, a visitor to that airless piety of books. The room had been kept tidy by absence, and absence had an accomplice. Third, a closing hand, a small domestic reflex, perhaps not even understood as guilt. I imagined Eleanor's voice saying immediately, and the adverb settled between us like frost on a boundary. I imagined Lovelace rehearsing innocence, Markham permitting logic to pass for taste, Arkwright collecting alibis like ticket stubs. Any could have closed a window. Innocence closes windows every day. It was the opening that mattered. I stepped nearer until my breath made its doomed circle upon the pane. Within the pattern I saw, or fancied, a tiny river veering, arrested in its own decision. In the library photograph an erased reflection had kept its smudge. Here the season preserved a different hesitation. The city owns these methods. It prefers to take minutes in weather. A door somewhere coughed. Footsteps approached, consulted the dark, and retreated with second thoughts. I waited until their echo succumbed. In the yard a thin rime began to claim the worn flagstones, each stone paler at the edge than at the middle, as though the college were practicing its own marginalia. I pressed the reasoning to its last polite clause, a body, a window, a frost that grew inward, therefore a visit, therefore a hand, therefore a mind arranging without daring to tidy the entire hour. I could not yet say which mind. I could say only that the scene had been amended, the way of verses altered, and the rhythm left limping. When I finally turned away, I felt that small lift, which comes when a contradiction agrees to name itself. The night seemed franker. A bicycle bell far off made the single note that punctuates whole paragraphs. I walked back along Beaumont Street with the ridiculous comfort of a man who has discovered less than he hoped, which is to say, something true. The pains continued there. Quiet writing, indifferent, capable, exact. The archives smell of a patience few men can afford. Dust lies as though it had signed a lease. Leather dries into a quiet crackle. The air waits for footsteps that seldom come. It was Lewis who handed me the page, folded into the spine of a register that had no business with it. He said it must have been misfiled. I told him nothing is misfiled that wishes to hide. The hand was not Hathersley's. It was rounded, deliberate, the kind that once practiced neatness in letters across a dining table. Eleanor's. A page that spoke of a night 20 years ago when a student failed to return from the Randolph when Edwin Venn's name had slipped into disappearance, when Hathersley had softened the record like wax under a candle. The words did not shout, they only placed themselves one after another until silence weighed more than ink. I carried the page, folded against me, to the chapel. It seemed the only place left where the college permitted candour. The door groaned in a voice older than doctrine, and the air smelled faintly of stone, watered by centuries. Candles leaned into their own smoke. She was already there, her figure framed by pews that had given up their occupants to weather. I told her I had something that belonged to her. I placed the page on the wood between us. She looked at it without touch, the way one looks at a wound half-healed. At last she lifted it, and her breath clouded the air above the writing. She said only that Hathersley had been too generous for his own good. The confession did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like frost, spreading quietly until every surface was marked. She spoke of Edwin's temper, the quarrel at the Randolph, the walk into fog that never ended. She spoke of Hathersley, young then, who had understood the scandal would cripple more lives than it explained. He had shaped the silence into something that could be carried. She had lived inside that silence, tending it like a hearth no one else could see. When I asked her why now, why death must answer for death, she closed her eyes briefly and said the past had begun to stir in the papers, in whispers, in her own fear of daylight. Hathersley had threatened, not with malice, but with a scholar's compulsion for truth, to publish what had been hidden. She could not allow the grave to be disturbed. She said it as one says the weather will turn, not with relish, but with inevitability. I watched her hands as she spoke. They did not tremble. They moved once to the stone beside her, palm resting on chill, as though to prove her own stillness. Her words fogged the air and vanished, yet left a residue that felt heavier than sound. I thought of the frost on the inside of Hathersley's window, beauty and indictment together. She had closed it, she admitted, after his heart ceased, not wishing the world to guess at her intrusion. She had wiped nothing, altered nothing else. Only the window, she said, only but that Lewis would have written her words in his notebook and underlined them twice. I simply listened. When she finished, she looked upward, not at me, not at the candles, but at the beams where dust had made its truce with light. She asked whether I would understand if she called it loyalty. I told her understanding was a smaller virtue than memory. We sat without speech until the bell outside called the hour, with an indifference that shamed us both. She rose, left the page on the pew, and walked the aisle without hurry. Her breath lingered a moment in the chapel cold, a ghost without grievance, then dissolved. I remained, the diary page beneath my hand, and felt only the faint roughness where ink had pressed too hard. Confession is never entire, it leaves the edges blurred. Outside, frost crept along the windows with a patience untroubled by guilt. Lewis had wanted the case bound in brown paper, labelled in a hand the clerks could read, and filed where it would no longer trouble his conscience. He said as much, leaning on my doorway, the hour late enough that the corridors carried only the groans of heating and the occasional cough of stone. "We've got what we need," he said. "The woman's words, the page, the past resurrected. Let's call it done." I nodded, the way one nods to a tune one cannot dance to, and told him I'd finish the paperwork later. He accepted the excuse, not the truth, and left with the kind of reluctant tread that betrays fatigue and faint unease. I remained. The flat smelled of whiskey and paper, the first sharp, the second weary. On the desk, the crossword waited, its squares like windows into which light had yet to fall. I had carried it through the investigation as others carry charms, creased, rebuking, half complete. The clue that mocked me since the beginning remained. Frozen truth, 7. I let the pencil hover, then, without flourish, set down the letters one by one. THAWED, truth, thawed. The word sat there with a smugness I resented. A solution, yes, but not a comfort. Truth does not thaw into clarity. It oozes, it discolors, it leaves edges damp. Eleanor's confession had carried the chill of inevitability, not warmth. The frost on Hathersley's window had been the first whisper, the diary page the last. Yet the story, once revealed, refused to glow with justice. It lay before me with the grey satisfaction of ice melting into puddles. I poured a measure from the bottle that had kept me company through lonelier evenings than I cared to number. The glass caught the lamplight, refracted it into something almost forgiving. I thought of Eleanor, her hands folded on stone, her breath fogging the chapel air, her words without tremor, yet laden with a grief no cross-examination could soften. She had not killed out of malice, but out of loyalty's distorted reflection. What good was the truth to her now, or to anyone? Oxford outside kept its facades, frost still blooming across panes with the artistry of silence. Behind each window, warmth carefully rationed, secrets rehearsed. The colleges survive on secrecy as much as on scholarship. Hathersley had been a custodian of both. His death uncovered little beyond the futility of concealment. And yet I, who should be satisfied with exposure, felt only the ache of having witnessed one more life unravelled by its own devotion. I studied the crossword again. Completed grids never please me. They resemble cemeteries, all order and no breath. The words look final but mean less than the struggle that placed them. Truth, thawed. Yes, but in thawing, shapeless. It was the frost itself that had been beautiful, not the water left behind. The whiskey dulled nothing. It sharpened the awareness of my own solitude, my own unwillingness to thaw. I thought of letters unwritten, of women admired from distances of intellect and cowardice, of moments where warmth had been offered and I had declined. Eleanor's sorrow mirrored my own, though hers at least had the dignity of choice. Somewhere outside, a car passed with opera leaking faintly from its windows, a fragment of Puccini riding the night until it was smothered by fog. I closed my eyes to listen, recognizing a line about love too fragile for time. Lewis would never understand, nor should he. Cases end for him where files close. For me they linger, half melodies that never resolve. I placed the crossword aside, the grid neat but unconvincing. The pencil lay diagonally, its point dulled to resignation. Through the uncurtained window I saw frost beginning its delicate labour once more, sketching on glass truths no man could preserve. I thought then that my own heart remained unthawed, encased in patterns only I could read, and wondered whether I preferred it that way. The night gave no answer, only silence deep enough to hear the faint cracking of ice. They took her gently, which is to say without noise. Lewis spoke low to the constable, and the chapel door received them with a sigh. Eleanor walked between them as one might walk through rain that has already decided its destination. I signed what had to be signed. The clerkly words kept their distance from the fact. Oxford excelled at such mornings, pale, damp, promising nothing. Frost surrendered its architecture along the sills, leaving bright wetness. I stood a minute under the archway and made the calculation one makes when leaving a case. How much of it would follow, how much I would refuse to release. Lewis said we had done as we must. He meant to comfort and managed only sense. I told him to go home, sleep, polish the report when his heart allowed it. He asked if I needed anything. I said I needed the walk. He nodded and shrank into his coat like a man rehearsing retirement. His footsteps blended with the porter's broom, a duet for duty and dust. I took the long way through lanes that prefer anonymity. Stone walls shed their white in slow tears. Windows sweated, the river pretended movement beneath a film that could not decide. I passed the Randolph where staff hosed the night from the pavement and thought of the first rumours, the bar where Arkwright collected evidence of his youth. Across the street a delivery lorry idled, its plates splashed by slush. The sequence letters marked it from the north, a minor deduction that explained the hour and why the hotel received bread before daylight. At Beaumont Street, the thaw turned from science to mood. Puddles described the traffic's intentions. Pigeons rehearsed survival under benches. A bus exhaled at a stop and left the faint sweetness of warm rubber. I watched a couple share the silence that follows words badly chosen. I turned into Jericho, where the ordinary day was putting its shirt on. The pub windows wore beads instead of lace. I thought of Hathersley's inner frost and the hand that had closed a sash to make certainty plausible. The case had ended not with triumph, but with that tired equilibrium the law calls resolution. Eleanor's motive would be printed in miniature, the scandal restored to its drawer. What remained belonged to Weather. I considered telephoning the master, and did not. I considered writing to Markham about her misprized logic, and declined. I considered visiting Lovelace to tell him his envy had been almost sufficient, then pitied us both. Afterthoughts are my private sport. They never improve anything. The only letter I wrote in my head was to no one, perhaps to the version of myself that still believed solutions warmed a room. Near the canal, a car drifted past with its window open 2 thoughtless inches. From that slit slipped the ghost of Puccini, a line about the impossible fidelity of love. The melody lifted and thinned. Beauty travels poorly in cold air. It breaks into weather and costs the listener more than the player. I stood until the echo gave up, and then I walked again. By the time I reached my flat, the thaw had grown confident. Drops gathered on the railing, considered patience, then leapt. Inside, the crossword lay completed on the desk, insufferably pleased with itself. Truth thawed. The answer had solved nothing beyond its own appearance. It had given me the shape of a puddle and asked me to call it clarity. I poured a small whiskey, not as victory, but as witness, and watched the glass fog and clear underbreath I could not claim as steady. Outside, the panes let go of their drawings. Streets returned to their usual expressions. I set my coat on the chair and closed the window against the damp. Through the melted glass, the world looked no clearer, only wetter